Hey folks, welcome to the Neo4j Twitch stream, brought to you today from the middle of my living room. If you don't know me, my name's Will. I work at Neo4j on what we call the Neo4j Labs team, which is a team that works on tooling, extensions, plugins around the database. And today I want to share some of the things that we've been working on in the land of GraphQL. So if you haven't heard of the Neo4j GraphQL integrations, they're part of what we call Stack, which is this framework for building full stack applications. So that's GraphQL, React, Apollo, and Neo4j database. You can find out a lot more about this at grandstack.io, where we host the documentation. There's also a blog that has lots of examples as well. But today, what I want to talk about is how we can use GraphQL really easily, basically one click in Neo4j Sandbox, and then also give a sneak peek of some of the tooling that we've been working on around GraphQL. So let's go ahead and jump over to Neo4j Sandbox. So neo4j.com/sandbox. And I'm just going to go ahead and spin up a Neo4j Sandbox instance. So if you're not familiar with Neo4j Sandbox, it lets me log in and then choose from a bunch of different data sets and use cases. And it gives me or anyone who signs in, a private Neo4j instance that's hosted by Neo4j somewhere in the cloud. But what's really nice is this is great for development, just playing around. These are temporary instances, but they live by default for 3 days. I can extend them for up to 10. So really nice for development and playing around with new apps. So I spun up the recommendations data set. This has data on movies and reviews. You can see here's the connection credentials, and I have a bunch of different code snippets in different languages that I can use with the Neo4j drivers. So let's take a look in Neo4j browser at what this data set looks like first of all. So Neo4j browser, this is like a query workbench for Neo4j, so it lets me run queries, visualize the results. The recommendations Sandbox instance comes with these browser guides that give me this sort of guided experience. So I have Cypher queries and images embedded in here that I can use to, in this case, generate personalized recommendations based on movies and reviews. But instead of going through that, let's just take a look at the data model. So DB schema visualization. So we can see we have movie nodes that are connected to actors and directors who acted in or directed the movie. And then we have users who have rated the movie, and movies are in a genre. So that's the kind of data that we're working with. We can run Cypher queries like, I don't know, let's find a movie and some actors who have acted in a movie. Let's just look at the first 10 and return those. You notice sometimes that we lose our captions in the visualization, so a really good trick is to just do a colon style reset, and oftentimes that gives our captions back. Anyway, here's a few movies: Jumanji, Grumpy Old Men, and the actors connected to them. So this is Neo4j browser. We saw how we could use some of the Neo4j drivers with Sandbox, with these code snippets, to build an application. And what I want to focus on today is GraphQL. So oftentimes we don't want to just expose our database to the world. Instead, we want to build some API layer that can sit between the database and an application where we control certain logic on what's exposed and things like that. So the Neo4j GraphQL integrations make it really easy to build that GraphQL layer that sits between your application and the database. there's a code snippet here that shows how we can use the GraphQL integration with Sandbox, but there's also this deploy to code Sandbox button. So I'm going to click that, and this is really nice because it's going to give me a GraphQL API running in the cloud connected to my Neo4j Sandbox instance with just one click, which is really, really nice for development and playing around. So let this spin up. If you're not familiar with Code Sandbox, it's a really, really nice service that lets us run JavaScript hosted, again, in the cloud. We can run both client JavaScript. So if we want to build things like React applications, we can also run Node that runs in containers, again, on the cloud, but we don't have to think about that. So in this case, we're running a Node JavaScript container with some JavaScript code. Let's take a look at what's going on here. So as this container spins up, first of all, it installed some dependencies. So it's installed Apollo server. This is GraphQL tooling for building GraphQL server APIs. .env, this is just for pulling in environment variables, which we'll see where that's used in a second. And then it's also pulled in this dependency Neo4j GraphQL JS, and we can see all of these in package JSON right here. So Neo4j GraphQL JS, this is where we're going to be building this GraphQL API on top of Neo4j talking to our sandbox. So the first thing this container does, let's make this full screen here. So the first thing this container does when it spins up is runs this infer.js file. And what this is doing is it's creating a Neo4j driver instance that is going to be pointed to our sandbox instance. You can see where these environment variables get picked up. These are the credentials for the sandbox instance. And then it's running this infer schema function from Neo4j GraphQL JS. So infer schema allows us to generate a GraphQL type definition file by inspecting a Neo4j database. And in this case, it writes those type definitions to this schema.graphql file. So here we can see the type definitions for the Neo4j instance that we were just looking at in Neo4j Sandbox. We have users who have rated movies. We have movies connected to actors and directors and so on. So that's really cool. Once those type definitions are generated, then we run index.js, which is pulling in this make augmented schema function, which we're passing our type definitions to, and then spinning up an Apollo server instance, which gives us a GraphQL API. And this is, we can make changes to this code and save it in Code Sandbox. Again, it's private to us, which is really nice. But also, we have a GraphQL API. I'm just going to copy this, bring it up into full screen here. So this is GraphQL Playground, which you can think of as kind of, again, a query workbench for querying GraphQL APIs. It has this really nice exploratory feature so we can see what types and queries are available to us. So let's just start off here. Let's search for a movie. Make this a little bigger. There we go. Now, one thing that's nice about the Neo4j GraphQL integration is we start off with just those type definitions that describes let's take a look at that here, describes the data available in the database. But when we go through this make augmented schema process, we add things like filtering, pagination, and input types in GraphQL, which is nice. So we can now filter, in this case, for movies where the title contains whatever we want. And then when we match on that, let's just bring back title, and oops. And some actor names. Oops, we have, what's our mistake here? Filter, title contains, oh, extra bracket, right. Okay, there we go. Fixed some formatting there. Okay, there we go. So filter for movies where the title contains river runs through it, and then bring back the title and actors. So this is really nice. We have a GraphQL API running on our Neo4j Sandbox instance, basically with just one click that deploys it to Code Sandbox. And that's nice. So that's basic CRUD. We can query for data, but what if we have some custom logic we want to add to our GraphQL API? In this case, maybe we want to generate some personalized recommendations or something like that. If we jump back to our Code Sandbox and now to the GraphQL schema, on our movie type, let's add a field. Let's call this recommended. This is going to return movie objects, and we're going to use the cipher directive. And this is going to allow us to create some custom logic in our schema. In this case, it allows us to bind a cipher query to this recommended field. So then in my GraphQL query, I can say, show me the recommended field on movie. And we want to show, well, if we're looking at A River Runs Through It, we want to show some similar movies that a user might like. So how can we do that? Well, let's say match this. So in these cipher directive fields, the this keyword, there's a parameter injected in these cipher statements where this is the movie being resolved. So in this case, in our example, this is River Runs Through It, a node object in the graph. So let's look for users who have rated this movie. So for users who have rated A River Runs Through It, what are some other movies that those users have rated? Right, so this is kind of the simple collaborative filtering. Users who bought this product also bought this other thing kind of recommendation. So pretty simple, but just gives us a place to start here. Then we'll take the recommendations and we'll do a count as a score and order by that score. So the more people that have reviewed this other movie in common with the one I'm looking at, that's going to give me a higher score and be rated ranked first in my recommendations. Okay, so let's come back here to our GraphQL API, and if I refresh and now look at the docs, I should see a recommended field now on our movie type, which I don't see. Let's refresh again. Let's take a look here. Did we? Let's see. Did we restart? Each time we update the schema, our code sandbox needs to run again. Okay, let's see. Did our URL change? Let's take a look here. Let's go ahead and restart our sandbox here. Make sure this gets picked up. Okay, now we have our recommended field. So we just needed to restart code sandbox instance there. So now we have our recommended field to pick up, let's say, the title. So for River runs through it, we'll bring back the title and the recommended movies. We can get the title for our recommended movies. So here's the most recommended movies based on our really simple recommendation query there. Now, of course, we can also traverse this data graph a bit further. So let's get all of the actors for these recommended movies and so on. Cool. We may also want to, I forgot my order by here. As score, order by, score descending. So the order by is important here to make sure that we are showing the movies with the highest number of overlapping users first. Cool, so we can also, in these Cypher directive fields, we can also add arguments. So we may just want to show maybe the first 10, maybe the first 3. We want to be able to, at query time, specify the number of recommendations that we're going to bring back. So let's add a first argument. We'll set that to a default value of 10. And then here in our Cypher query, this argument is going to be passed as a Cypher parameter, which we can use this syntax to return recommendations, limit first. And by default, this will be 10. So let's refresh and simplify this a bit. Let's take out our recommended actors. So we don't need to specify this. It's optional, but we can specify, just show me the first 3. And we can see now we're only getting back the top 3 recommendations. Cool, so there's a lot we can do here with working with GraphQL and Neo4j. If you want to see more about how this works, the docs are on grandstack.io. For example, here's the documentation on the filtering argument, which we were looking at. We have these nice graphical embeds that sort of show us how this works. There's also a page we were looking at adding custom logic with the Cypher directive field. So there's a lot we can do here. We can also add custom top-level query and mutation fields using the Cypher directive. Maybe we want to take advantage of a full text index for searching, that sort of thing. So there's a lot we can do here, but I just wanted to sort of demonstrate this one-click GraphQL deploy on Neo4j Sandbox, which is really handy for development. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. But I think I'll move on to the next thing I want to talk about, which is some sneak peeks at some of the GraphQL tooling that we've been working on. So the first one is, let's jump over to the GrandStack GitHub repo. So the first thing I want to talk about is this GrandStack CLI. So this is a command line tool that allows us to do some operations using the Neo4j GraphQL integrations. So this is sort of built on top of Neo4j GraphQL JS, but kind of abstracting away the idea that you have to think about writing JavaScript code or think about running a Node.js server. Instead, it gives us a CLI to, for instance, start a GraphQL server. We're working on some deployment targets, being able to infer the schema from Neo4j and things like that. So this is very much a work in progress, but it's available now with some limited functionality. You can install it with npm install -g grandstack to install it globally, and then that will be available as a binary command in a terminal. So let's take a look at how this works. So let's do grandstack GraphQL infer schema. So this will allow us to connect to a Neo4j instance and generate those GraphQL type definitions. So here, for example, we'll connect this to our sandbox instance. If we go into the connection details, we can put together the bolt port, which is right here. Let's copy that. And then our Neo4j user is Neo4j, and Neo4j password for our sandbox instance is right here. And when I run this, it's going to connect to that sandbox instance, and in this case, just log the generated GraphQL type definitions, which I could then save to a file to edit and add in my custom logic. I can also pass the run server flag, which will generate the GraphQL type definitions and then run my server locally. So here now I have this running on localhost 3003. All right, and so I can now query my sandbox instance from a GraphQL API locally without having to write any resolvers or type defs, which is pretty handy. There's some other functionality in the CLI, things like passing in type definitions, again, some deployment targets. And again, this is very, very early work in progress, but we would love feedback if you install this and play around with it. The other sneak peek piece of tooling that I want to show and talk about a little bit is sort of a UI that runs on top of this, this CLI that I just showed. So it's nice to be able to have some user interface that we can use to almost like an IDE for building these GraphQL APIs that then sits atop our CLI. So we don't have to think about writing these commands or maintaining our type definitions and so on. So one thing that we're working on, which is a graph app that will be available within Neo4j Desktop. It's not available yet, but just a sneak peek at what this looks like in development is what we're calling GraphQL Architect. So GraphQL Architect allows us to do things like query our GraphQL API. It embeds Graphical, which is this tool for querying GraphQL APIs. But the real functionality is here in the editor. So in this case, I have a GraphQL schema editor. I can do things like infer the schema from an existing Neo4j instance. So this is connected to a Neo4j instance that I have running in Neo4j desktop. And I can do things like edit the schema to add new fields. Maybe I want to do something similar to what I was doing with the movie recommendations, where I want to add a cipher directive field, maybe for businesses. So I can add that logic here. Let's just leave this as a blank statement for now. But I can add my custom logic and then start a GraphQL API locally, and then query that in Graphical embedded in Graphical Architect. So let's search just for some businesses. Let's just bring back the name field just to prove this is working. So this is querying my, my data set, in this case, in Neo4j desktop. Cool, so this is something we're working on. Look to see a release around this sometime soon. We'll see how it goes. We have some minimal functionality for it, but there's still a little bit left to do before we release that publicly. Cool, so that is pretty much what I wanted to cover today. Just a quick stream to get us started here. Again, if you want to learn more about the GraphQL integrations with Neo4j, the docs are on grandstack.io. I think for next time, it might be interesting to look at what's involved in building an application with GrandStack, sort of starting from scratch. So I did a little Twitter poll. Let's find the tweet here. Here it is. So I did a Twitter poll last week, kind of asking what kind of application would people like to see, and the result was social network, but I think we can actually combine all these features. So I think what we'll do is start a stream where we're building a Zillow clone. If you're not familiar with Zillow, it's a site that has real estate recommendations, or not real estate listings, and then we can sort of see recommended listings based on ones we've saved and things like that to bring in the recommendation component. And then we'll think of some social component we can add to that. So let's start that maybe next week. We'll add it on the Twitch calendar and maybe sort of starting from scratch, see how we can use GraphQL, Neo4j, and GrandStack to build out this application. Cool, so be sure to check out the Twitch calendar and subscribe to the Neo4j Twitch stream so you can get notifications when we go online. And that is it for today. Thanks a lot, everyone. Cheers.